to, however you want to take it. Go ahead, Caroline.
Welcome.
Right. Thank you. Good evening. Happy to be here tonight. I do have a PowerPoint to go through with you, so I'll share my screen here and we'll start going through the results. Everyone able to see that?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Now, I can find where I need to go. Okay. There we go. So the main reason that you ask us to work with you is to provide an opinion on your financial statements. That opinion is housed within the independent auditor's report. Also within the independent auditor's report, both management's responsibilities and our responsibilities are outlined. And management's responsibilities are for the preparation and fair presentation of the financial statements in accordance with GAAP. And then our responsibility is to provide that opinion. So what that's getting at is that we are not able to determine the numbers and provide an opinion. There has to be a line drawn in the sand. So that's management's responsibility to determine what those numbers should be and what they are. And then we then check that. So the opinion that we're providing is what's called an unmodified opinion. That's the highest level that you can receive and not a change from what you would have received in previous years. And what we mean by that is that we believe the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects as of December 31st, 2019. In addition to just looking at the numbers, we also conducted our audit in accordance with government auditing standards, which requires us to consider internal controls as we go throughout our process. There were no written internal control findings in relation to that work. One final component of the audit is in regards to Minnesota legal compliance. The Office of the State Auditor puts together 7 checklists full of state statutes that we ask a number of questions about. In regards to those, we did not have any findings in relation to any of those legal compliance items either.
I apologize for interrupting here, but
No.
City Administrator Brad?
Yes, sir.
We're looking at my agenda here. Should we have done a roll call?
We should have. We'll do that really quick. Apologize for the interruption.
Not a problem.
It's my fault.
It's okay.
You know, when I say your name, say here. Cross.
Here.
Coleman.
Here.
Licio.
Here.
Tabbitt.
Here.
And Olson.
Here, thank you. Again, sorry, go ahead, continue.
Not a problem. That was a perfect break, actually. Now we switch into the financial analysis and the charts, more of the fun information, I like to think. So we start with your general fund revenues, and this is presented by category, but in total, general fund revenues did increase by about $560,000 for the year. Taxes increasing with an increase in the levy, and then charges for services increasing. There was some additional revenue from the school district this year in regards to a full-time police school resource officer. This is also general fund revenues, but more of a budget to actual presentation for you here. So the first column being the final approved budget, just over or about 7.2 million. Actual is in the second column, so 7,368,000. And then the variance is in this third column, 171,000. That is, if we put that to a percentage, that is 2.4%. Your largest item there with a variance is in the miscellaneous, and that is a result of conservative budgeting as far as investment income goes. And that is very common because that fluctuates very regularly. The last slide that we have here in regards to general fund revenue takes a look at them in terms of like a pie chart format. So how much of all of the revenues collected and and the percentage of those. So showing that taxes does continue to be the highest collection of revenues for the general fund, coming in at 85.2% for 2019. And then the charges for services increasing as a percentage of the pie, as we touched on earlier. So then we have a similar format for your general fund expenditures, presenting them here by category. And in total, general fund expenditures increased 11.7%. All of the categories did increase, as you see here. And reasons for that had to do with increases in labor costs, increases in attorney fees, as well as an increase in contracted services for a new position in the Culture and Rec area. Here is a budget to actual presentation for those general fund expenditures. So similar format, starting with the final approved budget on the far left, 7.3 million, just under 7.3 million of actual. So under budget there by about 56,000. Again, we've got that percentage point on the far right, and coming in less than 1 percentage point is about as close as you're going to get. So I always like to think that that's pretty impressive to see the less than 1%. So great job there. And the variance that you are seeing in the general government area there's a number of pieces that came into play there. Really has to do with insurance, repairs, other services coming in less than was anticipated, as well as a staff position being vacant for part of the year. So like I said, a number of things coming into play there. And then public works expenditures, you see that that was over budget a bit there. That had to do with repairs and maintenance needed for streets. Similar pie chart presentation then for general fund expenditures, continued allocation of spending there, very consistent spending year over year, with public safety continuing to be the highest category, followed by general government. So then we pull all of that information together more high level for the general fund here. Total revenues, total expenditures, we've touched on that. That led to the change in fund balance, and fund balance actually ending the year at just under 3.9 million in total. You're seeing a line item here for unassigned fund balance. That is the piece of fund balance that is tied to the goals you have in place for your fund balance policy. You analyze that unassigned fund balance in relation to the current year revenue. And if we look at that, you are at 49.9%. So that is also in line with what the Office of the State Auditor puts out as a recommendation, that you have at least 35 to 50% of fund operating revenues. So you are in line with that as well. This chart takes a look at tax capacity, the levy, and tax capacity rates. So the top line there being your tax capacity, that increased 3.6% for the year. The levy increased 6.7%. So the result of that activity led to the tax capacity rate just increasing slightly there, ending at 52.95 for the year. Then we shift gears a bit, and the rest of the slides look at your enterprise funds. And we begin with the water fund. Operating revenues for the water fund did increase for the year. There was an increase in rates as well as usage. And then operating expenses increased as a result of an increase in labor costs. The result of that activity was that there was an operating loss. That is the gray bar that you're seeing there. That includes depreciation expense. We then include the orange bar, factoring depreciation expense out. And we do that as a means to analyze if the charges for services in these enterprise funds fully cover all of your operating costs, including that depreciation expense. And the reason for that is the intent for that, or the idea behind that kind of, is that you would help to set dollars aside for future replacement by covering all of that depreciation expense. Different methodologies regarding that, how much is covered and how far, you go with that. So when we analyze those two bars, the gray bar and the orange bar, for the water fund, you're covering 80% of depreciation expense in this fund. And again, that can fluctuate from fund to fund, from city to city, based on where you want that to be. Couple of things to keep in mind when we look at this chart. This is before any debt payments. This fund does have debt obligations to the tune of about $3.5 million at the end of this year. And outside of this information were principal and interest payments of about $560,000. So we talk about that because there are items like this debt, principal and interest that fall below the operating income loss line. And we talk about them in regards to how that can still impact cash and the need for having to think of those debt obligations and those payments in regards to also the health of the fund. So we talk about it in terms of cash investments here, healthy operations here, for cash and investments as well as unrestricted net position. So cash investments increased $227,000 for the year. So even with those additional payments, you were still experiencing an increase in that total fund balance because there were significant availability charges as well as capital contributions that were obtained by this fund. We include unrestricted net position here as well. If you were to look at the statement of net position for your water fund, you're going to see an additional component for net position for investment in capital assets that's net of related debt. Those dollars are tied up in your capital assets. You couldn't use those for future operations. So that's why we analyze the unrestricted net position. That's more comparable to what's available from an equity position for future operations. So all of that being said, takes a little bit longer on this first chart to explain some of this extra information. But that being said, that unrestricted net position increased about $286,000 as well. So healthy fund balance, or healthy net position balance, healthy cash balance in your water fund. Similar presentation then for your sewer fund. Operating revenues were down about 1%, operating expenses up 1.7%, and seeing that continued operating loss. And again, we can factor that depreciation expense out to arrive at the orange figure that you're seeing there. When we do that for this fund, you're covering about 22% of depreciation expense. And what I would say is that's very common for sewer funds to not always be covered quite as much, just because they're so infrastructure heavy. So again, if we factor in some of the non-operating type revenues and expenditures that fall outside of this, for example, the availability charges, capital contribution, things like that, your net position did increase by $221,000 in total. And then here's a similar presentation of the cash investments and then that unrestricted net position. So seeing that cash went down just about $150,000 for the year, and then unrestricted net position was up about $338,000. So a slight dip in that cash investments, but overall still very healthy positions for both of the components you're seeing here. Stormwater fund is up next. Operating revenues here increased about $45,000 with an increase in the fees, and then operating expenses increased about $127,000. There were some structure repairs and maintenance, so a little bit additional costs there this year. So that did lead to that gray bar decreasing a bit, that operating loss. And again, if we do that comparison to the orange bar, the charges for services for the stormwater fund are covering 67% of depreciation expense. This fund did have significant capital contributions related to the projects that you had going on this year that were stormwater related. And so net position did increase by about $2.6 million. And we touch on the difference between total net position and unrestricted again, because all of that increase went into that other component that I was telling you about earlier that's tied up in your capital assets. So even though that total net position increased, what you're looking at here for unrestricted net position, which is really what's available for future operations and spending, it increased, but not to the tune that we just touched on there, increasing by about 35,000 instead, or 50,000, excuse me. And then cash was up about 11,000 for the year. So also healthy operations for the stormwater fund. So those were the slides that I had prepared to go through with you. I'd be happy to take any questions on any of that information that you may have.
Just a quick question. Our depreciation numbers on all of those different funds there, are we in line? Is that normal? Is that average?
Yeah, I would say it does fluctuate from, like I said, from fund to fund and from city to city. Each is going to have a different philosophy on how high you want those charges for services to be in order to cover that. I would say it is rare to see them 100% covered. So from that perspective, so yeah, I think you're in line with what we would typically see.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Great. Well, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of the work that goes into this process. It's a lot of additional work outside of daily responsibilities for your finance team, so we really appreciate all of that help with the process.
Okay, council, any questions?
There are none. Jeremy, would you explain what you're asking of the council in regular session?
Sure. As part of the annual audit, we do ask for approval of the financial statements and the audit that was just presented tonight. So that's on the consent agenda. If you do need more time to review it further, we can certainly put it on a future agenda. But as Caroline indicated, it was pretty straightforward, unmodified opinion once again, and overall the audit went fairly smooth. Just had a lot more to close out this year with some of the larger capital projects with Cypress and so forth.
Okay, anybody else?
So Cypress is completely done now, right? Everything is wrapped up?
There's some warranty work I think that's being done, but we closed out the project, yes.
It's a big one.
From a financial standpoint, we did anyway.
Mhm.
Okay, if we're done, need a motion to adjourn the workshop.
I'll make a motion
Motion by Alessio,
to adjourn the workshop.
motion by Connie.
Mr. Cross has his hand up.
Okay, I've lost my pictures here.
Second.
All in favor, roll call.
All right, Cross,
Aye.
Holman,
Yes.
Licio,
Yes.
Tabit,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.